Today we have Udi with us, and he's the CMO of Gong. And without further ado, I would just love for him to introduce himself. And I know he's been at Gong for about 5 years. So Udi, nice to have you today. I would love to hear from you, your story of how you got to Gong and became the CMO.
Hey, excited to be here. So yes, I've been with Gong for 5 years now. Here's a fun fact. This is the third company that Amit Bendov, our CEO, and I have worked at together. The first company was way back in 1998, and no, we were not teenagers back then. That was Click Software that would eventually sold to Salesforce. Fast forward about 10 or 15 years, we worked together for quite a while at Panaya, another company that was lots of fun and got sold to Infosys. And fast forward a few more years, Amit calls me in July of 2016. He said, remember the crazy idea I told you about? We built the product, we rolled it out to about 12 beta customers, and 11 out of the 12 became paying customers within 3 months because they didn't want us to shut the thing off. I think we better start marketing this. Can you come help? And at that point I said, sure, what took you so long? And it's been quite the ride since then.
I love that. Many folks on my team at my company I've worked with for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So I completely understand how that works. And it's such a pleasure to work with someone over and over again in such a way. I think that that's probably going to be part of the answer to my next question. So my big question for you to start and kick this off is, Gong has built an amazing brand and has such a clear sort of approach to marketing. At least for me as a marketer, when I look at the brand, that's how I feel about it. Even though I don't use Gong, our company does not use Gong today, we are ready to use Gong the second that we possibly can, just because of your marketing. And so I'd love to hear from you how you created this. And I know this is a broad question, but how did this happen? Like, how did you make this happen as a CMO in terms of the brand, the ethos, what I feel about the company, even without being a customer yet?
So that's a fantastic question. And I want to start, like I always start answering it, by deflecting credit away from me and from the rest of the marketing team. Here's why. Marketing does not create a brand. Marketing does not own a brand. Marketing is the steward of the brand. We can polish it up. We can decide what part of it to externalize. But brand is not the logo. It's not the colors. It's not the typography. It's not the illustrations. And it's not the photography. Your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. Your brand is how you treat your customers. Your brand is the value that they're getting from your product. That is brand. It's what the entire company does. In our case, we try every day to create raving fans. And most days we succeed in doing that. And to the degree that we can do that, that creates the favorable brand that you've been seeing even before you ever started using the product, because you see our customers posting about their wonderful experience with Gong. You see our employees, or as we call them, Gongsters, post about their experiences with Gong. I can't create that in marketing. No marketer can create that. You can fool some of them some of the time, but you can't fool all of them all of the time. And to get that organic feel from customers, from Gongsters, from partners, from people doing business with us and wanting to work with us, that's a company-wide effort. So marketing can take that, can amplify that using Gongsters and customers and influencers and a variety of other ways. But the core has to be created by the entire company.
That's amazing. That kind of is the best answer I could have heard from someone like you that's been in this role and has built helped build such a great brand and such a great experience. So for myself, one of the first ways that I actually understood Gong was actually by Googling and finding your content. And in particular, a lot of the PDFs you've put together that are not those 40-page white papers and are instead really pithy guides on very tactical sales-focused sales kind of tips and things like that, with how to handle objections and all those kinds of things. I would love to hear from you on how you thought about building and producing that content. I mean, you already answered it on a high level of like, give people what they want is how I'd summarize some of the things that you said, but I'd love something a little bit deeper, a little more tactical if you're open to it, to basically describe how you came up with that strategy. It is a little selfish for me. This is something I'm thinking about for ourselves, and you folks are definitely one of the role models on creating great opt-in content that I went and actually downloaded all of them. I even found them using some Google searches because I'm pretty good at Google with like finding like the actual content itself and all the different material to the point where I'm like, can I just put in my email once? Can you just give me everything? And I don't know if you've done that yet or not, but your brand's content, Gong's content, definitely that's something that I would want because I have like 20 different opt-ins I filled out. Again, this is more tactical marketing issues, but that's not what my point is. My point is I'd love to know how you got to such great content that, like I said, I know the brand because of the content and how valuable it has already been to me.
Right. So I love being asked about our content because there are really no secrets here. And the formula is the same one that I've used at several companies, and it always pretty much works. So at the very high level, what you want to do is create content so good that people are willing to pay for it. Now, let that sink in for a minute because a lot of B2B brands say, what do you mean people are going to pay for it? Who pays for content? Well, of course you pay for content. You pay for your podcast, you pay for your Spotify or your YouTube or your Disney Plus or your Netflix. Of course you pay for content. Why wouldn't you create B2B content that's that good that people are willing to pay for it? Now, when you get there, you kind of know that you did. My team, for example, every couple of months gets an email from either a university professor or a head of a sales training program asking us to buy rights to our content so they can use them in their college course or in their training program. And we always love when that happens and we circulate that email internally because we said, yes, we've done it again. We've created content so good that people are willing to pay for it. And of course, we never take money for it and just ask people to attribute it to Gong, but use it as freely as they like. Now, more specifically, how do you go about that? So start by thinking about content that you, if you're like your target audience, would want to consume. If you would not want to read this email or watch this webinar or attend this event, why do you expect your prospects or your customers to do that? So that's a very important test that I think a lot of marketers just skip and they assume that, oh, this is something that's important for us to say, so it must be important for them to hear. No, it doesn't work that way. You've got to start with what's important for them. Now, in Gong's very specific case, the way we did this, I arrived on my first day of work. It was August 1st, 2016. And I asked my CEO, Amit, how do I create our first piece of content? What do you have for me? And he said, I've got nothing. I said, no, come on, you've got to have something. And he took the dust off of this presentation that he'd used a couple of times, which had literally 5 slides in it. And it was what they had found, what Gong had found, the very early team, what they had found by analyzing like 20,000 calls from customers. They found that the best sales reps, about 46% of the time, and the rest of the time they listen. And that increases their chances of getting a second call with that customer. They found that 4 to 11 is the optimal number of questions to ask on a sales call. Below that or above that, you're not going to get that next call. And there were 5 of these slides. I said, I mean, that's it. We're going to create our content strategy around data-backed sales tips. Because if you go to Amazon and search for books on sales, you'll find more than 100,000 books. That's a real number. And the problem is that those books were written by some really smart people who had great experiences at companies like Salesforce and Xerox and Apple, and they wrote about what worked for them. But there's very little data, if any, to suggest that this would work for your company. And so this is where Gong decided to come in and provide something unique to sales professionals and leaders that did not exist before that, which is data-backed sales tips. So we're now listening to millions of calls, and we're understanding what really works and doesn't work, and we haven't changed that strategy for 5 years. We created the Gong Labs series, and for the last 5 years, every other week or so, we put out a new, heavily researched article that tells you about one specific area, how to use questions, how to use patience, how to use swearing. There's so many different things you can do or not do during a sales call, and that's what we've been providing the sales world. And I believe every company can find their angle, either using your customers' data or your own research, or just putting something not trivial together that your reader could not just Google for the answer. Because if your reader could Google for the answer and they can get it in 20 other places, then you're not providing any unique value.
I really love that. I think that it's not just a shameless plug for Gong. It's something everyone should be figuring out how to do, which is listening to these sales calls and even just understanding the customer perspective and then bringing that to the marketing team in whatever ways make sense, or having the marketing team go ahead and get that. So you mentioned the P word, pandemic, and I'd love to hear kind of from you, because we can't have one of these without talking about something related to the pandemic, of course. What has changed? What hasn't changed? Has your approach changed in any way since the pandemic when it comes to kind of running your team or even just marketing in general?
Yeah, so I think two things changed, or rather became more pronounced since the pandemic. One of them is understanding how our adaptability is so important. Um, Marketing teams and other teams have been talking for years now about being agile and about listening to the market, but very few get it right. I still see marketing teams where they have this content schedule. Here's what we're going to be talking about in Q3. I don't know what I'm going to be talking about in Q3, no more than I know what I'm going to be having for dinner tomorrow. The world is changing at such an amazing pace that you've got to stay attuned and you've got to be able to adapt at very short notice. So here's an example for you. When the pandemic started, we heard, using our own tool, Gong, that some of our reps in the commercial segment, which typically sell smaller size deals, were having to go through their buyer's CFO to justify the investment in Gong, because if you remember in the early days of the pandemic, the CFOs just clutched their wallets and said, everything goes through me and we're only making critical purchases now. And our content team had the insight to say, well, if our sales reps are going through this, I bet many sales reps are going through this, so they would love to hear tips for getting through their buyer's CFO. So it took them about 48 hours to turn over this cheat sheet for getting past the CFO. And they put that out there in an email and in an article. And that quickly rose to the top of the charts and became, I think, our second most downloaded piece of content ever. And that's not something that took them months to put together, not something that they planned 3 quarters in advance. They quickly saw the need in the market. They put something together in 48 hours, and it was an absolute hit. Now, if we were rigid and saying, well, no, this was not part of our plan, we've got to stick to our plan, we never would have put that content out there. And so adaptability is absolutely something that I think we've all learned during this pandemic. The second thing is the shift to virtual events, which I have to say that amongst all the negative things that these last 18 months have brought to all of our lives, both personally and professionally, I love the transition to virtual events. I love the fact that we can drive 10 times more people to a virtual event than I ever could to an in-person event, because I can now drive people across geographies, across time zones. I don't need to worry about their passports being valid, about their visas coming in time, or about missing a whole week of work just to fly to somewhere across the world to attend my conference. They can now tune in for 2 hours or 6 hours or 7 hours and then go back to their work. So virtual events is a huge transition that I believe is here to stay. I think the future of events will probably include small local chapter events. So there might be the Illinois Gong user group and the North California Gong users group. But I think the large conferences, the national, the international conferences, they're all going to come back in a hybrid or virtual format, because they're way more inclusive that way. They allow people from all over the world and different time zones to attend. And they're way more beneficial for the organizer. I get a lot more bang for my buck when I'm doing this international conference that I can drive 10x the number of people to. Now, I probably know what your next question is, so I'll go ahead and answer it now. A lot of marketers ask me, well, Udi, if you drive 10x more people, you're still having a different level of engagement with those people, because maybe at a regular conference, an in-person conference, I could drive 10% of the attendees, if they were well targeted, into that next step of their opportunity. But you can't do that at a virtual conference, because that level of engagement is not like taking someone to the bar or for a coffee after a session as you would in an in-person conference. And my answer to those people is, you're absolutely right, but look at the numbers add up. Let's say that my conversion level of attendees to the next step is not 10% like an in-person conference. Let's slash it by half. And you can make up your own numbers. The rule still applies. Let's slash that by half and say I'm only converting 5% of my attendees. But here's where it gets beautiful, because instead of driving, again, make up your own number, 1,000 people to your in-person event, I can now drive 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 people to my virtual event. So even if I only convert half of the percentage that I would at my in-person conference, I am still ahead of where I would be in an in-person conference. And that's why I love virtual events. We've created a ton of marketing engagement points with them. I've been able to expose thousands and thousands of people to our content, to our brand, to our customer stories that I never would have done if we were all still in in-person conferences. And those engagement points have turned into meaningful business for the company.
I'm glad you got right into the virtual events and kind of the difference. I've been doing remote work for the last 18 years, so I'm in heaven with these virtual events and how people are kind of setting them up and coming up with these really creative ideas like the magician and things like that. I heard about what you folks did. I wasn't at the event, but that definitely had a ripple effect, the creativity you folks kind of brought to the table there. So for my final question, I like to do this in any interview, and I've always got a backup plan in case you don't have an answer to this. But I'd love to ask you what I should have asked you that I didn't, and I'd love to have you answer that if you're open to that.
Wow, that's a big one. What should have you asked me? What should have you asked me that you did not ask me? Okay, I'm going to make this up on the fly. I think you should have asked me about balancing brand building, which we're kind of known for, with demand generation, which everyone does and doesn't always get the spotlight that it deserves. And a lot of sales leaders, CEOs, and even marketers ask me, like, how do you balance those two? How do you decide how much to put into brand awareness versus demand gen? And isn't one of them eating up the resources for the other? And here's what I say. They are actually complementary. And I'll demonstrate what I mean. By creating a bigger brand, you're making demand gen much easier. And by generating a lot of demand, you're by definition increasing your brand awareness. And so what we try to do at Gong is we spend around 80% of our programs and resources on demand gen programs that we can measure. And then we take the rest of the 20% or so, and sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, and we spend it on brand awareness things. And they can be like out-of-home advertising. They can be the Super Bowl commercial. They can be other sports sponsorships and fun stuff like that. And I know for a fact that that helps my demand gen. How do I know, you ask? Well, here's another shameless self-plug. We use Gong. So during Super Bowl week, we set up a tracker in Gong to listen to how many calls mentioned Super Bowl. And we found hundreds of customer calls where the prospect and customer said, hey, I saw your Super Bowl commercial. That made me finally want to ask for a demo and come talk to you. And so now I go with that to my CFO and say, hey, Tim, look at all these calls that came in because they saw us on the Super Bowl. They didn't come in because of my LinkedIn advertising. They didn't come in because they did a Google search. They came in because of the Super Bowl. They said so themselves. And that's a fantastic way of measuring that. Here's one more example. Our CEO went on this podcast that we had to pay some money to get him on. And we didn't know what was going to be the effect. So what do? We set up a Gong tracker. And then we hear literally dozens of sales calls saying, oh, I heard your CEO on that podcast. You really piqued my interest, so I decided to take a call and listen to what you have to say and show me. So by doing these things that are building brand awareness, we're taking calculated risks. I'm not going to spend 80% of my budget on these stunts, but you spend just enough to see the impact. And I know it's helping my demand gen. And of course, the more demand gen I create, the more I increase my brand awareness. So that I think is an important lesson for every marketer to understand and be able to articulate to his leadership and to his sales leadership, because sometimes they don't understand that, and then they just say, no, focus everything on something you can measure with Google Analytics. It's got to be demand gen. I don't believe in that brand awareness stuff. You don't have to believe in it for it to work. So I'll conclude with that.
I really love how you tied the word of mouth into that, where you actually have a feedback loop on those branding efforts, and you're paying attention, it sounds like, to like what you hear about what people are seeing, what they're doing, what their experience is. So that was awesome. And yes, I should have definitely asked you that question considering where I started. Thank you for being here today and answering these questions. I learned a bunch, even being a marketer myself first on the internet. This was very insightful, and I'm really glad I got to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. I love being here, and I invite folks to connect with me on LinkedIn or go to gong.io for your revenue intelligence demo. Thank you so much.